Meeting House Hill is pretty much everything you can see that's over and open up through here. It's 31 acres. It goes from the highway here across to Cemetery Road, which will lead you. What we're going to do is we're going to walk up the hill. We'll stop down when we reach the trees, and I'll talk a little more about the road. Then we'll go to the top of the hill, where you'll be able to see out across the valley. We'll come back down. I'll talk a little more in these places. Then we're going to cut across the field to the cemetery. So we'll be over there at about quarter of. Now the Strongs farmed this field from 1900 when Norman Hollister, one of the previous ancestors, bought the field and the barn. He could have bought the house for $500, but didn't want to bother with the house, so he got the barn and the field. The house has a date on it of 1780. If that's correct, that goes way, way back. The barn we're not quite so sure of. There's probably always a barn here, but it may have changed hands a number of times. It certainly goes back to the late 1800s. In 1938, hurricane, the roof blew off the barn across the street and did some damage to the Eckers barn, which is across the way. This was Eckers Farm across the way before school came in. The Strongs used it, Norman Strong used it for cows. He'd bring the cows over every day from his barn, up Dark Road, up here, and up to the top of the hill, mostly to graze, and then at night he'd bring them back down. Anybody old enough to remember stopping traffic here when they bring all the cars across, or the cows across the road? I can remember it. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I remember too. It was always kind of fun in a way because it was farming and we were in a farming community. Before the Strongs were here, from 1763 to 1826, this was a road up Meeting House Hill to the meeting house that was on top of the hill. Meeting House was built in 1762, and for 63 years that was the primary church in town. And the highway went up along the road here. Before Meeting House Hill, back in the 1600s, this was a Native American Indian path. Route 30 was the prime route from Connecticut River, where the Podunks had summer campgrounds, to the winter campgrounds on Schnipset Lake. So this was a main thoroughfare. Why here? This is the ridge between the Hockenham and Tankerhoosen watersheds. So you don't think of it as a ridge line, but it is. It's a little higher than everything else. If you took a bucket of water down to where Center Road comes in, you dump on Center Road, it runs to the Hockenham. You dump it on Bolton Road, then it runs down into the Tankerhoosen. So it's a ridge line. Why wouldn't the Indians have taken the easy path around the hill? Why go through here and up the hill? Two reasons I think of. One is there's a spring at the base of the hill where they could, have gotten water, and also it likely attracted game because you could go down to the two rivers, obviously, but if you're up here grazing, that made a very good place. So it was probably a place for game. Also, this is the only place along the ridge line, really the only place in East Hartford where you can get a view out over the Tankerhoosen Connecticut River Valley. As you'll see, it's an interesting view. Very nice. Okay. So the Indians picked that path up through there, and they probably jogged up there because they had the view and whatnot. Red Barn, I've talked about a little bit. The field is currently owned by Meeting House Hill, LLC. When Norman Strong died in 2010, the property was divided into several pieces. The barn went to a nonprofit. The house is still owned by Geraldine and Nancy Strong. And this section and another 17 acres on West Road went to a family partnership, family trust basically. In 2014, the family trust decided they wanted to sell the property and basically convert it to cash. So they put it up for sale in 2014. And a group of us in Vernon, Carl and I and several others, looked at it and said, oh, that's terrible to lose that. It's such a beautiful field, it's got history, we need to find a way to preserve it. So we put together a package and bought it within 6 months and are now going through the process of grants and getting the grant money back and that type of thing. So that hopefully by the early part of next year we'll be able to return the property basically to the community. The Connecticut Farmland Trust will hold the development rights. Within that there's a clause that says the public has to have access to the field. Eventually there'll probably be a path going all the way around it. Right now there's no formal path. Okay, so it's a long process going through that. I think we'll start here pretty soon. All right, Carl is the property manager, and he can give you an idea of what's here now and what we're doing with it now, which is pretty much the same thing as Strong's did with it. If you'd like to have a peek inside the barn, we can go around the other side. So you want this, or you want this talk? Okay, I'm going to pack this up.
John told you most of the story of the property. When it came up for sale by the family LLC back in 2014, we were worried that they were going to...
Yeah, if you want to grab something, grab it, because I'm going to pack this up because we're not coming back this way.
John, turn off here. We were worried that some developers were going to buy it, and they were looking at it. I have to tell you a story. Back in the early 90s, we had a Vernon Land Trust group. Came to one of our annual meetings, and he said he had met with a developer back then, the early 90s, and he had been offered $1 million just for this 33 acres. He turned it down, and he told us, he said there were two fools at that meeting, him for offering and me for turning it down. So fortunately he did, but with that thought in mind, you know, when it came up for sale, we really wanted to protect it. Working with Nancy, we wanted to keep it working farmland, and that's the plan. So as we get the state and federal money to pay back the LLC, this will go to Connecticut Farmland Trust. They then are going to transfer it to the current nonprofit, that is the Strong Family Farm that Nancy and her board run right now. So it will be back together. They can plan to continue farming it. We have two current tenants that are using it. You'll see a big field of corn here. That's leased and run by High Tone Farm down on Route 44 in Coventry, part of the Farmers Cow Consortium. And then the fields are being used to pasture cattle by a fellow that lives over off of Lake Street. Raises cattle with his son. He's got them all at the county fairs right now, so we're free to walk up the hill without having to pet cattle today. But that's the plan. Hopefully next year, as John said, we'll have it back to Connecticut Farmland Trust, back to the Strong Family Farm, and then it will then be protected forever as in the 501c3 nonprofit world. So thank you for coming out today. As I said, a lot of people think this is important to not have houses on the property. This one and the one across from Garden Barn is parallel to the sledding hill. That's the other 17 acres that will be, hopefully when we get it into their hands, these farmers would like to improve it, cut down the brush, put some fertilizer down, start using that to raise hay and corn as well. So hopefully that all works out to plan. So again, thank you for coming. Enjoy the walk today. If anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to have a chat with you.
Are there any other questions at this point before we start on our way? Yes.
Is the red house occupied? The
Yes.
antique? It is.
Oh, great.
It is. Oh, it's beautiful.
Have you ever traced the ownership back to 1780?
A bunch of names. We've owned it since 1926.
Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. We did mow the path in the field, so you won't have to quite walk through grass. We'll go down to where the trees are, and I'll talk a little bit about the road itself. So why don't we start on down there? Yeah, exactly. So this road was used by churchgoers for 63 years. It's been a dirt path for almost 200 years when they closed the road. So the dirt you see underneath you is the dirt that the Indians walked on. It's the dirt that the colonists walked on going to church. And this is the first time that the public has been on it in almost 200 years. So you're a special group. I was reading through the town annual reports, as I'm sure everybody does in their spare time, and I ran across this interesting entry that refers to the road here. This is from a town meeting which they called just for this purpose. They said the convenience and safety of persons walking and traveling, this was written in 1816, 200 years ago. The convenience and safety of persons walking and traveling in the highway, especially in difficult places, is of public concern. And immediately west of the meeting house in Vernon, the road goes down a long, steep hill. You're on it. So that people on foot are greatly exposed to be run upon by sleighs, wagons, and carriages of all descriptions. So put that in your head, especially on a Sabbath. And then they proceeded to vote that the posts that are standing in the road to protect the sidewalk be continued and kept in constant repair by the surveyor. And any person who pulls up, cuts down, breaks, or otherwise injures the posts shall pay a fine according to the aggravation of the offenses. We had no idea that there was a sidewalk here. It's pure speculation. I would guess that side, and there would have been some kind of posts in the ground here. It's it's just pure speculation. There's nothing otherwise in the record that there was such a thing. When they came in here, you have this little wetlands going down through here. It's not a major one, but it's wet and it gets marshy at times. So the churchgoers and the early travelers built that little bridge you just walked across. You can see the stonework along both sides. And so that bridge has been here for 200 years too, which is interesting. You'll get a nice view of it from the side. It's very pretty. That particular big bushy tree, I think that's the one, in late October will turn the most beautiful orange. And the tree has survived because the cows like to get under there on hot summer days and just kind of lay down and rest. You can begin to get an idea of what this looks like. So let us go on up to the top then, and you'll get the view. It's mowed all the way. There's a little circle at the top. I hope everybody can fit in, or most people can fit in anyway. If anybody does not want to make the hill, if you want to wait here, we'll be coming back down and then cutting through the field. But it's not a terribly steep hill. There's some loose stones in this first piece, but when you get up to the top, it's just plain field. Okay, we're there. You made it. Congratulations.
The big house there is owned by Hans Weiss. Yeah, that one there. He is Hans Weiss. He's the one that you probably have seen his painting. He's also one of those who are a partner in the house hill. Not surprising.
Well, yeah, if you turn a little more to the left, you see the Box Mountain down through there. It's not, you can barely make out the buildings in Hartford today, but on a clear day, if you stand here, you can see the steeple of Thomas Hooker's church that he built in here.
I think I can see it.
You might, that might be it, yeah.
Which is pretty awesome. Where?
Yeah, I like to extrapolate and say, well, maybe that's one reason they decided to build their meeting house up here, because they could see the mother church out across the valley. So you're seeing the Tankerhoosen Valley and the Connecticut River Valley on out, and in the, say, mid-1800s, they were probably growing corn, had hay fields, probably cows all over, and it probably looked very much like it does today. You're going back in time.
There probably weren't as many trees. Was right here?
Oh no, the meeting house was up further. There's nothing to see now. They came in with the development in the 1950s and kind of, but the meeting house was long gone from there.
Yeah.
The meeting house was built in 1763, sorry. Before that, the inhabitants out here had to trek to to 7 miles to Bolton to go to church, and up until 1818, church and state were one, so you were required to go to church basically, and if you broke a church law, you were breaking a state law. So they were really all melded together. So people would walk that long distance down there. Can you imagine packing up your family? And in the early days particularly, they walked. When they got a little more money, then they'd have something to ride. But I can't. Winter, snow, and everything. So that was the first complaint. They said, well, can't we have a winter parish where we don't have to go down in the winter, because it's an awful hardship working our way that far down. And eventually they said, yes, you can have a winter parish, which was probably held in either a schoolhouse or in somebody's home. So from, I guess it would be November to March, they would have that. And then as soon as they got that, they started petitioning for, well, can't we have our own parish up here? And they had to wait a number of years to get more people. And eventually we had to borrow a few people from what was East Windsor at the time. The center of town at the time was just a quarter of a mile past Vernon Center. We didn't have Talcottville. We didn't have the Hockenham River over there. We didn't have Dobsonville. The town line was there. So when they wanted to site the meeting house, and there's some argument about it, it's more to the center of town to be up here than down in what we think of as Vernon Center. So it would have made more sense that way. The cemetery was just down the hill on Old Bamforth Road, was put in 1751, so that was there. Some of these homes were already up here. It was already farmland. So it made sense to be up here, but also in those days they liked to site the most important building on town, which they felt the meeting house was, at the top of a hill, or in the highest hill around. They used the meeting house for much more than church. It was where they held town meetings. There was a school built right next to it. There was a crossroads put in there so you could get to it from different directions. And that was there for a long time. The Indians, as I said, came up here, and one of the reasons they may have come up here was for the view. They could see out a great distance for game, for seeing anybody's following them, who else is coming along. In 1636, Thomas Hooker took his church from Newton, Massachusetts to Hartford. It was a 10-day trip. He took the whole church. He took the cattle, wives, children, and they followed Indian paths, because in 1636 that's all you had. The Indians invited them to the area. They hoped to get some protection, and so they led them down through this. Jason Newton, who I thought was going to be here, but I guess didn't make it, did a talk 2 years ago for the Vernon Historical Society, in which he talked about, he has been tracing the trail of Thomas Hooker because he's a descendant. So he feels they came down through Wellington, through Tolland, and may have camped the last night before they went into Hartford at Schnipsett Lake. So I like to think, since this was the main road, that I think that probably the cattle went down more along the river, but I would like to think that either he scouted or whatnot, that Thomas Hooker came out here the night before and looked out at his future home. This is where I'm going. We've come 9 days. It's been a hard trip. There it is. One more day and we've got it. So I like to think that Thomas Hooker stood where you're standing. Then the trail went quiet for almost the next 100 years, as Bolton Notch was more the main route through, and the settlers were all down in the Connecticut River Valley. So you probably had like a few Indians, explorers, hunters, surveyors were out this way. And then again it picked up as I already went through when it became North Bolton, and people began settling out here, and they brought the church out here. After they had built the church, the next thing they needed was a minister, and they were very fortunate to get Reverend Ebenezer Kellogg, who was minister here for 55 years. Yeah, his whole career was spent in that little church up on the hill. He never got to see the new church when it was built. He lived in the area. His family and grandchildren grew up in the area, and I won't go through that history, but they were very prominent in building some of the mills in town. Kelloggsville, the future Talcottville, was a Kellogg, a grandson. And he owned a lot of the property up around, well, where the 7-Eleven is. Up and down Bamforth, South Street, and here. I don't believe he owned this field, but they did own where the church was. The grandsons bought that. On a typical Sunday, if you were going to church here, you'd, as I said, you'd go up the path and onto church. the girls would bring their stockings and shoes and stop at a house across from Nancy Strong's down at the end of, I think it's Dart Road on the corner, and they'd change their clothes there before walking up the hill. And then on the way home at night, they'd stop down there again and change their clothes. They kept Sabbath, kept Saturday night and Sabbath during those days, which meant when the sun went down on Saturday night, everything had to cease. You couldn't go out in town unless you were an official or a doctor or something like that, and you couldn't do it again until Sunday night. I guess they let them come to church though with the wagons, but that's it. So they were very serious about the religion in those days. And I think that's pretty much everything. Any questions on what I've covered? Yes.
Exact unit?
No. I talked to Lynn Cloder Fahey, who was in the Ellington Historical Society, and she grew up, Cloders grew up, well, down on Hartford Road. And she recalls, and she checked with her brother, who recalls seeing some kind of foundation up here somewhere. But in those days, when the 50s, when they came in with subdivisions, they really didn't have to do any archaeological work, so clear it all. The building itself went down and became part of what today is the Florence Mill, and it became the east wing of that and burned down in the 1850s, so that was the end of that. The property itself went to Hubbard Kellogg, one of the grandsons, and it was only a half acre anyway. Yes, please.
So, yeah, I was going to ask the same question. You don't know the exact location of the meeting?
I don't. I've never found anything with the exact location.
Any educated guesses?
Well, there is a plaque over there, which it's a plaque to just a memorial to the meeting house. Whether it's in the right place or not, I have no idea. No. There was very early post which one of the relatives put in, but that vanished too. So I don't know. I also don't know exactly the route of the road after it got up there. Some place it turned back out, but I'm not sure where, and I would love to find an early map, but they just aren't around. Yep.
So Rockville was established after this area?
Oh yeah, Rockville was a tumble of rocks and brambles, and it was almost impossible to walk through Talcatville. They started building up from the west end down where West Street is, and they started building up that way, sort of, and then they would go down over Vernon Avenue and do it. And Kellogg's grandson George helped build the rock mill down there, so everybody got into it. But that was all around the 1820s, maybe, when that started really picking up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's some mills on the Tankerhoosen River started a little earlier. Warburton's mill started 1796, and so Dobson Mills, they came in the very early 1800s. But Rockville was a little later. Yep, yep. Okay. Yes, yes, that's it. Yep. Yeah, if you drive up there, you'll see the plaque. It's a dead end. Okay. I guess we can go back down the hill then and have a few more words. And if you go out to the website, the Meeting House Hill website, you'll get a lot of it. I just went a lot deeper in the talk.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you.
Okay. Around 1800, they started serious business with the stagecoaches, and the Hartford and Tolland Turnpike Company got rights to this section of road. So they needed to make the roads a little smoother and better. So I think it was at that time they took the road around the hill and widened it, and it was flatter and easier for stagecoaches and travelers to use. So for a time then, the only people that were using this road were those that were going to church. In 1826, they finally decided that they had outgrown the church on the hill, and they built the current church down here. I was a little surprised they took so long. Church on the hill never had heat. In the whole 63 years, there was no heat in there. People would bring foot warmers. And I don't know, Lynn, where'd Lynn go?
It couldn't be found.
You couldn't find it? Okay.
But when it's found, it's going to come to the church.
Okay, but they think they know where a foot warmer is. So that'd be fun.
It's in Lynn's house.
Mm-hmm.
Although that'd be a good idea.
At least through the winter. So after the new church was built, they didn't need the church up here anymore, so it went down to where the Florence Mill is now, and they had no need for keeping the road open and maintaining it. So the town voted, as it did on many of the old roads, to close the road. So the road closed in 1829, and then that was the last public use of it until today. So you're part of history, or resuming history.
How did you find, how was the road rediscovered?
It's always been here. It's always been here. Oh, one thing I didn't point out, if you look at the houses along Hartford Turnpike, they're all square to the road, except the red house and the barn. And they're at an angle as the road goes. So it's kind of evidence that the house was built after the road was here and went up the hill. We kind of know where the meeting house was. There's a lot of documentation from Alan Kellogg and others about, you know, what it looked like up here, what the church was like, how they behaved during church, dimensions, and what it looked like inside. I went through some of that last weekend. 1956, the houses were built on Sunnyvale, and then the Strong family farmed the field here for 115 years until Norman died, and had they not, it would probably be some sort of development today. You'd have lovely houses all along it. Why Meeting House Hill and the field is important to me, and I think really should be to Vernon as a whole. It's our only real reminder of our origin, which was the meeting house, which was up there for 63 years, which most town business was conducted, as well as the church, as well as was the social center, and the school was up there. And this is our last memory of that beginning. So from that point of view, I think history is important to connect us, give us something common to connect to each other and to connect to the town, and, you know, kind of make ourselves feel part of it. I wasn't born here, but I love the connection anyway. It's one of the few farms left in the area. We let most of our farmland be developed over the many years. So you have Strong Farm, Driggs Farms, Clark's Farm, and up at the TAC building you have a little room, and everything else is gone. So it was important to preserve this, to remind people of the agricultural community we were for so many, many years. If you look at the 1934 aerial pictures of Vernon, which they did back then, the whole state, you'll see the whole place is mostly farms. People would build their farms along main roads, and then their farm would be sort of narrow but long out the sides of it.
They'll see a picture at the church.
Okay.
You'll see pictures taken from the steeple. In later years, in 1939, I believe, and when a new steeple was constructed, and you'll see pictures that were taken from the steeple in several directions, and it's very clear there how few houses there were, and the houses are labeled to tell you who was there at the time. So that's something to be sure to look for at the church.
Yep. And the last reason I think this field is important to Vernon is Vernon Center has a lot of historical buildings in it, and was also part of our old history. It's got the church, obviously. The Strong Farm is still there. The little school on the corner was a very early schoolhouse. A lot of the houses along there were old, the Grange. And this being old and connecting to Vernon Center as a historic district, it's not an official historical district, but it's unofficially one. So it kind of just connects and ties together a lot of the old history. So we feel it's a very important part of town. So, okay, going to walk down through the field. There's one area down there that there's some ruts in. We'll kind of draw your attention to it when we get down there. And just past it, you can see back to the spring house, and I'll just tell you a little story about the spring. And then we'll be through.
Well, we'll find it
There you go.
at some point
Yes, you will.
when we decide to downsize.
That seems quite
Interesting. You never know. I never knew that there was spring house stuff back on the hill up here.
It took us over a year to start moving that thing through where we could have our 300 square feet back and close the whole deal. We couldn't get our grant money until we did that, so we've just gone through the last set of loops, and Mayor Champagne had to handle that thing and take it through the council, but he first had to go through everything else and put it up for public to speak, and so that's just happened in the last month, so we're moving along there. So that's the old famous spring house back there. And I'll take the rest away. Right down here, and then right across to the...
That's a great farm.
Welcome, everybody, and it's so nice that John brought this. I don't have to yell at everyone. Thank you for coming out on a hot day. When we planned this, we didn't expect to have summer in September, but at least we didn't have a hurricane. So look at it that way. So you've braved the hill. The rest of it is all going to be just a gentle slope around here, and then you're off to the church. If anybody is in dire need of water, there's some in my back car there. The church will also have water and refreshments and a place to a bathroom break for you. So we've tried to make sure we got everybody covered. Okay. Well, we are at Elmwood, which is one of the 5 cemeteries in town, and you started out at the old meeting house, and the people that worshiped there were Puritans, which was the original Protestant faith, and they had a certain worldview that your life was, you practiced a godly life so that you would then, after you died, you would await the second coming of Christ and go on to life eternal. So when they laid out cemeteries, they called them burial grounds. It was pretty straight, pretty direct. The whole point was this is a holding place until you move on to the next stage. So how many of you have been over to Bamforth Road? That's Vernon's original burial ground. You know, and when you look at that, it's basically a big rectangle with lots of stones. They would have a headstone and a footstone for each person. So it was, and people weren't always buried with their families. It was kind of where there was room. I did a tour of one of the Hartford colonial cemeteries, and way back in the early times when, especially when the settlement was first being founded, they would often bury the dead at night so that the Native Americans would not know how many people had died. Even later in the Puritan era, when it was time to figure out where to bury someone, and they would use the stones as indicators, just to be sure, the sexton would take a big pole and just thrust it in the ground. If you didn't hit anything, you could go there. So it was a more austere way of life. Let's see, go back to... Okay. Now, it's interesting, Bamforth Road, unlike many burial grounds, is not next to the church. In most of the earlier colonial cities, it was right next to the church. The legend in Vernon is that in about 1741 or so, a family was moving from Bolton to Vernon, and they had all their goods piled on a wagon. And a little boy fell off the cart and was killed. And supposedly he was buried there, and they decided to make that the cemetery. So that is the legend, but it was an active cemetery till about 1841. So it's very interesting to take a look at that. The stones are usually slate with some sandstone, and the Puritans had put a lot of information on a stone. They would put down the obvious birth, death dates. They would add an instructional message. Reader, as you pass by, so once as you were, so was I. As I am now, so you will be. Prepare for death and follow me. Okay. So it was a way to remind everyone that your time is fleeting. But they also recognized that a lot of people didn't necessarily know how to read. So they would also put a lot of symbolism on their stones. And if you go up to cemeteries in Boston, Cape Cod, there's all kinds of things like skulls, death with a scythe, just cutting the souls down, the hourglass, your time is up. And that was a lot of the popular iconography for the time. But then as time went by through the 1700s, more faiths began to come into the area, and some of the Puritan imagery and theology softened a little bit. So you have by the early 1800s, a lot of the skulls are kind of morphing into angels. And there's one stonecutter up on Cape Cod that I couldn't make up his mind. He's got kind of an angelic face, but then you got like this necklace of teeth. So I didn't quite know where to go with that. But then you saw things like vines symbolizing regeneration of life, circles, life eternal. So the stones are supposed to be instructive. Well, as we move into the cemetery movement, which starts in about the 1820s, people were looking at what these colonial cemeteries look like. And in the cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, the cemeteries that were next to the churches had become kind of overgrown. Lots of, the cities were becoming very built up, a lot going, they just looked, and they started to look run down. People were also worried about them as a source of contagion and illness. So then you have the cemetery movement, the rural cemetery movement. So
Boston opens up Mount Auburn, which is a wonderful cemetery, well worth a visit, outside of the city. New York opens up, I think it's Greenwood, outside of the city. And these are designed to be places of contemplation. The word cemetery, which is much softer than burial ground, actually means sleeping chamber. So this is a place where you would come and visit your loved ones, but it was also a beautiful open space. And a lot of these cities didn't have parks yet. So people were encouraged to come to the cemetery on a nice day, visit the graves, but then just walk around and enjoy the beautiful plantings. And some of them have scenic vistas. Greenwood has a beautiful view looking out over the harbor in New York. So this was a place to kind of reflect on life, but it wasn't as austere as the Puritans. The stones had limited decorations, more just the information, no verses. But it was kind of more of a remembrance thing, serenity, contemplation, and there were more family plots. So you'll see some of that. I also ought to talk briefly about the stones themselves. Now, in the colonial era, they liked using slate, shale, brownstone, local stones. Slate is actually a marvelous stone. You can carve into it, and it holds the carvings up. However, if you get cracks across the top, then sometimes a whole piece will shear off. Sandstone and shale, sandstone gets kind of all gritty, and I'll show you some examples of that. But it doesn't hold the impression as well. The Victorians loved marble, and cemeteries with beautiful white marble. But as you can see, what's happened over time, we have air pollution, lichen, stuff from the trees. About 20 or so years ago, I used to bring school groups from Center Road on this tour. And when I was refreshing my notes a couple weeks ago, I was dismayed at how dark a lot of these stones have become. And I'm sure the highway is a big contributor to this. So, there are techniques to clean them, but then you have to decide, who's going to do it. And so there's a lot that goes into it. But fortunately, we do have a number of the information recorded. But it is kind of sad when you think about how much has been lost. So marble, again, has its positives, but the weathering is the big thing. The Victorians liked symbols like anchors to reflect hope, ivy to reflect memory, poppy for sleep, oak for immortality, and an acorn for life yet to come. A broken column meant a life cut short, and then sometimes you'll see a broken bud or a little flower, and that means a child. And even the size of the stones, the small stones usually mean children. You'll also see military markers for the different wars, as well as some of the bronze medallions that the veterans organizations put up. So, and then I just want to have a few words about Elmwood. So Bamforth Road began to become filled up, and with the meeting house closed, and they built the new church in the 1826, it was decided to put a cemetery closer. So they had to figure out, what to do. And thanks to the research of Carol Nelson, I was able to learn a little bit about how Elmwood started. The property was bought from Colonel Francis McClellan and Jacob Talcott. You'll see McClellan's stone, and Talcott's a big name, in 1834, and the first lot was sold in 1836. So this began in the early 1840s. Grove Hill in Rockville was opened a little bit around 1840s. This particular property kind of limited the park-like aspects of it. If you go to Grove Hill, you'll definitely see more of a rural style, the park-like style cemetery. But I can at least, by showing you some things, kind of give you some information, so when you visit other cemeteries, you'll recognize some of the symbolism, you'll know about some of the stones, and just some of the other things that cemeteries are good for. I mean, some people are like, well, what are you doing this tour for? The cemeteries are great sources for local history, clues about national history. They reveal social conditions like families, health, indicate religious trends, provide information about geology, and cultural trends such as immigration, naming customs, and of course genealogy. Okay, has everybody had a chance to revive a little bit? And good, okay, we're going to take a walk to our first place, so we'll just come down here. When my husband and I came Friday to kind of scope out the walk again, you couldn't see the fronts of the stones because it was the other part of the day. So this is a perfect time to come. But this is Halsey Fuller. His house is around the corner and right across from Vernon Congregational Church. So this definitely was a local family cemetery. And, and a lot of local families are here. Norman Strong is right up here up on the hill, and it's nice to see his family here as well. He's surrounded by his relatives and rests in eternity with family. So I think that was what they really wanted to stress, was having families stay together rather than be kind of randomly scattered. So this was Halsey Fuller. We're going to take a walk over here. You'll see there's two fenced-in areas. This is a real family plot. One is Kellogg and one is Talcott. So we'll go and stand in the Kellogg one in the shade, and I'll tell you a little bit about those. Cemeteries are often also reveal indicators about who was prominent in town, who had the money, who had the influence. If you go to Grove Hill and you go into the main part of the cemetery, you look around, there's a gigantic obelisk that E. Stevens Henry put in, and you could tell he was somebody of significance. This is the Kellogg family plot, and a lot of times they would have the information on the main obelisk, but they also might have smaller stones that would have initials or mother. You can see a few there as well. And then if you look across to the Talcott one, the same kind of thing. It's delineated by the stone and the the little railing, and it tells all the information about the family. So you know this was a pretty prominent family. What's kind of interesting and a little different about the Kellogg plot is that they're not all here anymore. And this Harriet Kellogg married George Maxwell. So you had two prominent families uniting. And her ancestors were here, and they were also at Bamforth Road. And she decided, she purchased a plot at Grove Hill. And if you go down around, it's got to kind of wind around a little bit, but there's the whole Kellogg-Maxwell area. It's very pretty. There's a nice pond with a bridge. And so she had all her ancestors removed and brought to be with her family. So they're all together, but it's a lovely spot to visit. But if you go to Grove Hill Cemetery, and you have to kind of go all the way around in the back, and it's kind of tucked down, but it's a very pretty, very peaceful spot, the little pond, the bridge, and so she's got multiple generations of her family all together. So, but they did put a little marker in, so if you came here looking for them, you would be able to find them. So it's something a little different. So, so that's kind of an interesting little story. So what we're going to do now is move on a little bit. Not making any judgments about anything, just mourning your family member. So that was a popular one, and then they have the decorative elements here. This is an example of, it might be hard to see, but it's a stem with some leaves and a broken rose, and this is for a child. And then this is Sarah, and it's interesting, you don't usually see the clasped hands. Oh, and it says farewell. So it's kind of interesting how some people have chose different imagery for their stones. And these are marble. As you can see, it's got the lichen all over it, and it's too bad, but it is what it is. So, okay, we're going to now go over here. That's actually an excellent question, because she wanted to know why the Talcotts weren't buried at Talcottville. When the Talcottville community was first set up as a mill village, it was called Kelloggville. And the Kelloggs were here first, and in fact, one of the first pastors at Vernon Congregational Church was a Kellogg. So they were well entrenched in here. But being entrepreneurial kinds of men, I mean, they set up Kelloggville, but then they turned their attention to Rockville. And they decided that their fortunes lay there. So they sold Kelloggville to Talcottville, and Talcott's called it Talcottville. You might as well. So I'm guessing that maybe this was already in place. And I know they have a lovely cemetery at Mount Hope in the Talcottville area too. I think that's a private cemetery. I don't think the commission takes care of that one. But it's worth visiting. Private, okay, yeah.
There were many branches of Talcotts. There was not just one line. There were many, many, many branches of Talcotts spread out all over.
Okay, so John was saying there's lots of Talcott branches, so these guys may not have been the ones that purchased Kelloggville, and so perhaps they're there as well. So big families. It has sunk a lot since I started talking about it, but it gives us a little indication of what was happening in American history. I just kind of rubbed off the stuff on there, but it says he died on board the steamship Winfield Scott on his passage from California, 1852. Who remembers what was happening in American history in the late 1840s in California? So we don't know, if he was there for that purpose and then came back. It's just guess, but it's kind of interesting that the family put that much information on the stone. He's not buried there. This is actually like I think they call him a centograph, but it's in his memory. But it gives you a little clue that apparently some New Englanders, this fellow in particular, may have gone there to seek his fortune. So it's kind of sometimes you have a lot of questions, but it is a little indicator of that. Okay, we're going to now come over here, and where we have the American flag. Okay, both of these stones are from the King family, Lemuel King and Lemuel King Jr. Lemuel King was the fellow that built the King Tavern, which later became the town farm, and that was up where it used to be the Red Apple Supermarket, but that little plaza up at the top, he built this tavern because that's where the stagecoaches were stopping. And so he also fought in the Revolutionary War, and he had made the acquaintance of the Marquis de Lafayette when they were both in the war. Fast forward to 1825, Lafayette is coming back for his 50th reunion visit, as it were, and travels all over the country. And he is invited to stop at the tavern of his old friend, which he does. He's trying to get from Stafford to Hartford, and he didn't get there in time to stay over, but he did come and have lunch, and it was like a major big deal. They had decorated the inside, and they had a band, and they celebrated it in a very profound way. And so that when I think it was about the daughters, the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, put in at the beginning of the last century, Lafayette Park, they have a stone with a big bronze plaque on it, and that's actually moved to the side of the intersection now. But apparently the French nation is doing in 2025 a 200th commemoration of Lafayette's visit. So somebody from the French consulate emailed and asked what we had. So I sent them all kinds of info and pictures. So maybe we'll get a Lafayette person to come and visit us. Maybe stay overnight this time. But what I like about this stone is because of the shelter of this ledge, you can see that this is probably what the marble looked like. It's kind of remarkable that hasn't weathered as much. So you have to kind of imagine that the cemetery was filled with these white stones rather than these gray stones. So now this is a stone in memoriam of Lemuel King Jr., and he died at 20. And here's his message. My dearest friends, as you pass by, on my cold grave then cast an eye, more not for me, nor dry up, tears. I must lie here till God appears. So that was his message. But this is kind of a nice a little bit of history, and then they've got the bronze marker for military service. Now we're going to cross the street and go over here and look at these stones. Now I had mentioned Francis McClenn, who sold the property to the town to put the cemetery in. Very interesting man. I forget the story of his military service, but there were a lot of people in Vernon who had money, had property, but weren't necessarily interested in agricultural pursuits. So they were interested in investing in the Industrial Revolution with all this new technology. So McClenn and a number of other people invested and built factories, the Rock Mill, for instance, in Rockville. And McClenn's portrait is in the Rockville Library. It's in the main reading room. So he was a very early leader, mover, and shaker. He was invested in the Rockville Mill. He put the paper mill at the top of Paper Mill Pond. But it's interesting, he chose to come back here to Vernon to be buried. So he died he was born in 1777 and died in 1861. These are two stones for his wives. This is sandstone, but this is held up remarkably well. Now, they didn't believe in divorce back then, but it was not unusual for a man to bury one or more wives, just because of, death in childbearing years or just things that happen. So we have Roxy McClenn, and Lord, I commend my soul to thee, accept the sacred trust, receive the nobler part of me, and watch my sleeping dust. And then he married again, and unfortunately had to bury his second wife. This stone is kind of cool. It's kind of deteriorated, but this was his daughter Maria. We don't know too much about it, but the harp is very unusual. So I'm assuming she liked music, or maybe she was, could play the harp. But that's a little hint of the person she was. And then here's a stone for a son. So it wasn't easy living back then for a variety of reasons. People lost spouses, women lost husbands, children died. A lot of the different diseases that we don't even think about anymore. Things such as childhood illnesses, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, waterborne illnesses, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, bacterial, strep, scarlet fever, smallpox, TB, polio. So, life wasn't easy back then. And I think when I take kids through, we talk about that we have progressed a lot. But, people did the best they could back then. We're going to take a quick detour from the 1800s and go into more recent stones. And this is one over here with the American flag. Okay, I didn't mention, I mentioned sandstone and slate and shale and marble. I didn't mention granite. And granite is a wonderful stone to use. It lasts forever. And you will see some granite markers they were pricey, but they look just as beautiful as the day they were carved. And they could be 100+ years old. This is a more modern one. And just like our society involves new cultural traditions, the same thing with burial traditions. People have, in the last 30 or so years, are personalizing the stones. They're not necessarily using religious symbolism. They're putting things on that mean something to them. There's a great one at Grove Hill in the newer section, and it's a windmill, and it says, "Don't forget to wink." And it's some kind of thing that the family knew, but it's kind of charming, So this particular family has put this up. They have a phrase that means something to them, a beautiful scene. "The world is not conclusion, a sequel stands beyond. Invisible as music, but positive as sound." So, and what they can do now with this, they can actually etch the granite somehow. I don't know how they do it, but it's nice, and it really holds up. Of course, you get the lichen no matter what. You can't really get around that.
I think it's something like fluoric acid.
It's what? It's
Like fluoric acid.
Oh, some kind of acid etching. Okay. And okay. Also, you might notice, you think, well, what's this new one doing here? Well, when the cemetery was originally built, they left paths up through the stones for the carriages to go up. But as time goes by, they don't really use that anymore. So they have sold some of those lots. So you'll see like several rows of old ones, and you'll see kind of a stripe of new ones. So that's just kind of how they've adjusted to that. Okay, we are now going to go. Okay, we're going to go up the stairs, up to the upper level there, and look around a little bit.
Jean?
Yeah, sure.
Over there with the fence, there's an empty space. Why is that? Would that have been a person that the headstone's gone, or?
That's a good question. Sometimes you can tell if a headstone was there because you might see something in the ground. This is where you could go to the cemetery commission. The cemetery office might be able to say, perhaps he bought 4 lots and nobody used them, but you never know either. So, good question. Yeah, I used to bring school groups up here, and they were determined to hear a story about something bad happening. It's like, no. There's no ghosts, no terrible things. This is just a place where people remember their families. Yeah, those steps are kind of interesting. They're tilted in, which makes them a little challenging. I think there was a flagpole up here at one point. Oh, right, okay. Get all disoriented here. Okay, this particular stone here is brownstone, and the reason I'm pointing it out is there's a great big crack here. So I think there's ways to fix it, but if there's no family members still living in town, who's gonna pay for it? So it's just, and people think that stones last forever. Well, they don't. And I especially stress that with kids groups, because the worst thing is to find out the kids went in and tipped over stones and ruined them, and here's that person's life lost because of somebody who was vandalizing it. So they need to understand that these reflect real people. At Grove Hill, there's it's a brown stone with a kind of an arched top, and it was carved in memory of a soldier who died in the Civil War, And he went off to war and died, and then his wife died during the war, so they may never have seen each other again. And it's got a beautiful, like a sword, and then the American flag, kind of in a swirl design, big crack across the top. Well, the Civil War organization, the Sons of the Union Veterans, have raised money, and they're in the process of having it restored. So that will preserve that. So it's in Grove Hill, and it's very distinctive with that archway on it, but preserves everything. So, okay, let's see. Oh, and another example of weathering. These stones here, this is little Emma and little Eddie, and I can't read it anymore. I had taken pictures of them, but fortunately, this is part of the Grant family. So, but I show people that these have been patched many times, but tilted this way, the range is going to keep washing the inscription off. But they did put something here, and Emma died in 1855, 1 year old. Eddie died in 1861, 3 years. This just points out, what happens in families.
Welcome to the First Congregational Church of Vernon, United Church of Christ. It's good to have you here, and it is great to be a stop on this historical walk today. So I'm just going to probably speak for about 45 minutes. No, I'm not really. I just wanted to greet you. It was interesting, as you know how you pull up your Facebook feed, it'll remind you of things that happened, and it was 4 years ago yesterday that my name went on the sign. Congratulations, Robert Burke. I know, right? Thank you so much. And so I came as the associate, and then over a year ago I was voted in as the senior. So this is a wonderful place. Vernon, I'm getting used to it from living in Orlando, Florida. It's a little different, a little bit. But I'm very, very blessed to be here at this church. And so I just welcome you. And Lynn is our historian of the church, and you see that she has a lot of things out here to share with you. This church has gone through a lot. So not just the physical tragedies, but it's just gone through a lot. And the people here are wonderful, loving, and resilient people. So this is a very, very awesome place that we are very proud of. So welcome, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks a lot, Robin. Okay, let's get started. I didn't choose to be mic'd up, so if you're not hearing me in the back, let me know. Kathy Foot is my friend back there. She'll tell me if it's... Give me a high sign, okay? Okay, so I'm just going to get started. Welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on the third leg of our Vernon Center walking tour. By now, you realize that while this is the third destination you have visited, each place you've seen is a part of the history of the First Congregational Church of Vernon. The Meeting House Hill site, the Elmwood Cemetery, and now the ground below this building, if not the building itself, comprise really the greater part of the early history of this town. This is a historical talk, so I will not be discussing the religious beliefs of the early church members. Instead, I'll be discussing the building, its care and keeping, and some interesting facts and artifacts that come to light when the contents of our historical vault, which is really just a big room in the basement, are examined. However, as a member of this church and as its historian who has been looking back, I would like to assure you that throughout all of our history, the church family, ministers, lay leaders, and church members have taken seriously belief in God and in the teachings of Jesus Christ, and in our desire to do good in our community and in the wider world. In trying to decide how to approach our history from 1826 forward, I find two themes jump out at me. The first is that the good times and the hard times the church has experienced have much to do with the demographics of the surrounding area at any given point in time. I would venture to guess that our church is not unique in this respect. The second theme, perhaps a subset of the first, is the care and keeping, I could say the ups and downs, of the steeple. So, you have seen the site of and heard about the first meeting house, and about Reverend Ebenezer Kellogg, the first and longest serving pastor of the First Church in Vernon, previously North Bolton. Reverend Kellogg died on September 3rd, 1817, in the 81st year of his age. What a change it must have been for the people of the church who had known no other leader than this good man, who had baptized, married, and buried so many over the course of 55 years. Reverend William Eli was called to succeed Reverend Ebenezer. His tenure was only 4 years. However, Reverend Eli was credited with beginning a Sabbath school for the children, one of the earliest in Talbot County, and perhaps in the state. It was under the next pastor, the Reverend Amzie Benedict, that the second meeting house was built. Nowhere does it state why. In 1824, it was decided to build a new meeting house. It has been speculated that by this time, the first meeting house, being 62 years old, had become shabby and outgrown, and perhaps no longer in the best location. The old road, which we just traversed, based on an Indian trail passing up Meeting House Hill, was being superseded by the new Hartford Turnpike Stagecoach Road, the new main drag in the town. A committee of 3 men was appointed to fix a place for erecting a meeting house. The records state that, having examined the different places, we have finally determined and fixed a spot on which said meeting house may be erected, being on the land of Francis McLean, on the west side of a Hartford Turnpike, between his dwelling house and the blacksmith shop of Captain Roberts, about 6 rods west of said turnpike, and between the second and third rows of apple trees from the south side of a young orchard, having stuck a stake on said spot. We are fortunate to have an original copy of the first Articles of Agreement to build a meeting house in Vernon in 1826. This document outlines how the meeting house was to be used and how it was to be paid for. Shares at $10 per share, available to any member of the society. Now, I just want to digress for one moment to talk a little bit about what an ecclesiastical society was in colonial Connecticut. And I don't, I'm sure it's more complicated than I know. But I did find, written by a church historian down in Ledyard on their website. You can find out a lot of information by poking around on other websites. Apparently people in her church at one point wanted to know about what an ecclesiastical society was. So this is quoted from her. In 1725, the organization that was to become the Congregational Church was an established church. In other words, the official church of the colony. It was not until the new state constitution in 1818 that Connecticut finally had no established church, although restrictions had gradually eased by then. Back then, there was no idea of separation of church and state, and I know John Rowe has spoken about that. An area wishing to start a new church needed the permission of the Connecticut General Assembly, who could grant permission to establish a new ecclesiastical society. These societies had the responsibility of raising funds, usually through taxation, hiring a minister, and providing a place to worship. The church itself did not deal with financial matters, leaving this to the society. Now, that's not to say that the people that went to the church, a lot of those, probably men, probably the landowners, certainly the men, were members of the ecclesiastical society. It's just that it was separated. But by the 20th century, most ecclesiastical societies were folded into the churches, and their responsibilities were taken over by a board of trustees or a similar group, a financial group. It was a slightly different way of doing things. But so when we talk about the new church being paid for, we talk about the ecclesiastical society raising the money, and I just thought that was a good place to stick that in. So this article of agreement also discusses subscription of the seats which were called pews or slips. In addition to the Articles of Agreement, which are over there, we have an original deed for a pew or a slip, number 15, which was sold to Peter Dobson on August 4th, 1829. So they paid shares to build the meeting house, and then another way they raised money was you owned your pew and you passed that down. There was a deed, and it says to all heirs and assigns. Then eventually they reverted back to the church at some point. In any event, after location and funding was taken care of, the raising of the building commenced. According to a local history book, the raising went on for 1, 2, 3 days from noon till night. Finally, with the aid of a barrel of rum, the raising was complete. A young boy who witnessed the raising of the meeting house in 1826 had become the Reverend Dr. Increase N. Tarbox by 1876 when he spoke at a centennial celebration of Tolland County. He remembered the event of the raising of the meeting house in this way. He made a poem about it. The speaker pauses here to state that in his humble way, he helped to raise the meeting house which Vernon has today. He helped by sipping of the punch which flowed in large supplies, by tossing pins for men to catch, and eating of the pies. And I'm sure that the pins were the nails. That makes sense to me. Dedication of the new building took place on April 4th, 1827. Recreated in a historical note written in a local newspaper 60 years later, you can see a copy of the program or order of exercises for the dedication service. A lot of these things that I'm referring to are on the display behind me, so hopefully you'll have, if you're not really ready to go home, you can take some time to look at the display. This new meeting house, as with so many New England Congregational churches, continued to be a place where the town conducted business. There was a special conference room in the building called the Town Hall, or the Town Meeting Room. It was the polling place for all of Vernon and Rockville, and all town meetings were held there. All voting took place here until 1856, when the town meetings began to be held in alternate years at Rockville and at Vernon Center. In 1865, all such meetings, as well as the polling places, were transferred to Rockville. In 1829, the old building, the church on Meeting House Hill, was sold to the Frank Mill in Rockville for use as its east wing. Ironically, after many changes in ownership over the years, this mill site became the U.S. Envelope Company. After the 1965 fire that destroyed the second meeting house, the one that we're talking about today, this is actually the third meeting house, the bell that hung in the mill tower of the Envelope Company was given to the church for the new building. Although the bell never actually hung in the humble building on Meeting House Hill, it definitely seems like a historical connection that was meant to be. So, the parishioners of the Vernon Congregational Church settled into their new surroundings and carried on with their worship and their work. In 1827, the women formed the Ladies' Association for Missionary Purposes. Their goal would be to collect monies to contribute to the American Foreign Mission Society. In 1832, they formed a group that would have a more local outreach. This was called the Vernon Female Benevolent Society. The men of the church were invited to belong to the Home Missionary Society of Vernon. This was a local manifestation of a state and national missionary movement that was developing in Christian religious denominations in the young United States. And we have some really old record books from the missionary societies that are interesting to look at. They kept very good records back then. In 1833, the church voted to purchase a building for the use of its minister. The house still stands on Lowton Road, almost across the street from Elmwood Cemetery that we just visited. This would be the church's first parsonage, or manse as it was sometimes called. sometimes called, because Reverend Ebenezer owned his own home and farmed his own land. Skipping ahead quite a few years, I will mention the current parsonage, right across the driveway there, which was willed to the church by Sarah J. Butler in 1912. Sarah and her sister Selena inherited the house from their father Silas, who was the owner of the first stage route between Vernon Depot and Rockville to carry mail and passengers. From 1887, the sisters operated the post office in Vernon Center out of an L on one side of the home. That too is, I guess that's hanging. There's a picture of the L, the post office L. According to a newspaper quote from an article written in the 1940s, the sisters were said to have taken their time in distributing the mail and really enjoyed reading the postcards. If you will remember, in my introduction to these remarks, I said that the good times and difficult times of the church, and by that I meant in the case of membership and finances, have been dependent on the demographics of the town. In the year 1837, we start to see how this plays out. As we know, Vernon Center was the earliest part of the town to be settled, and its roots were primarily agrarian. As time went on, however, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution were felt in rural Connecticut. The Hockanum River began to be harnessed for manufacturing, and around those mills grew the more urban area of Rockville. Just as the people of North Bolton petitioned to form their own church in 1762, the people who were starting to live and work in the northern part of Vernon decided they wanted a house of worship in proximity to their homes. Petitions were made, granted, and by October 26, 1837, the Second Congregational Church of Vernon, later known as the First Congregational Church of Rockville, and finally the Union Church, when that church united with another, was it another denomination?
No, the Second Congregational Church.
So there were actually two congregational churches in Rockville, and then they came together as Union Church. The church at Vernon Center lost 35 members, a significant number for sure. In any event, the remaining members carried on. During the early years of our nation, there was much interest in spreading the Christian faith to far corners of the earth. This zeal can be seen in the number of members of the Vernon Church who served as foreign missionaries. So here, okay? You will see a list of some of these missionaries as part of the display. They were supported with prayer and loving care by their church family back home in Vernon. They were always acknowledged in special services or publications of the church. Special collections were taken up for their support. In 1851, the church building was moved back from the road. I can find no record of the reason for this. And at that time, the spire and the steeple were added, as was the portico with the column. So at that time, it began to look like what we have today. After these renovations, there was a service of rededication. Now, I just want to point out real quick. Here is a sketch of, it says southwestern view of Vernon as it looked about 1830. Now, this was John Rowe. I saw you walk in as Mr. Barber. What was his first name? Mr. Barber was an artist and a historian that went around Connecticut, right? And he liked to draw sketches of various town greens and the town. And I really want to say that he had a good vision for what he thought it should look like. But at this point in time, in 1830, even though it looks great, it's not what our church really looked like at that time, because it wasn't until the 1850s that it was completed and looks more like it does today. So
Maybe Lucius.
he took artistic license.
Is it Lucius?
I would say. Let's see. Okay. Another change to the physical surroundings of the church took place in 1866, when the Ecclesiastical Society, again, the financial arm of the church, voted to sell a building lot on the south side of the church for $50 to be used for a school. The school was used for many years. Mrs. Geraldine Strong, longtime church member, former FCCB historian, historical society member, and Grange member, recalls attending this school when she first moved from Manchester to Vernon as a young girl. After its use as a schoolhouse, it became a firehouse for the Vernon Center area of town. The building and land were redeeded to the church in 1961, and the building was torn down due to disrepair. Speaking of the Grange, the Vernon Grange rented the meeting room in the church for 42 years, until in 1928, they decided to build the new Grange Hall across the street. Of course, you know that's the Historical Society now, too. Because the church fathers did not allow dancing and card playing in the church hall. Those Grange members needed to have a little more fun. There came another blow to the church membership when, in 1867, 41 members were dismissed from the church. That sounds harsh, but they weren't dismissed as punishment or anything. They were dismissed because they wanted to leave to form a Congregational Church in Talbottville. Here again, we see the mother church giving way to the passage of time as the mills were built and the people followed. In 1896, a sad day arrived when the church steeple was taken down due to its decayed condition. A building committee was formed to raise funds to replace the spire and repair the church building. It took considerable time for this to occur, but over time the steeple rose again. I'm just not sure when. I haven't been able to find it. And I want you to be sure, well actually, I think I'm going to read this to you because it's really interesting and I don't know that you'll all get it. So this is the tip of the spire. And Carol's shaking her head at that, yes. This is the tip of the spire of the steeple when it came down, when it purposely came, when they took it down in 1896. And this is a note from Geraldine Strong to explain why this is here. The spire and the portico were added to the 1826 meeting house in 1851. In January 1896, the spire was leaning, and it was decided that it should be removed before it fell and damaged the church roof. Contractor Waldo Driggs of East Hartford was hired to take it down. A crowd gathered to watch. It was announced that the first person to reach the steeple after it hit the ground could have the tip of the spire. The first person was my husband's grandfather, Norman Hollister Strong. He mounted it on a piece of wood and hung it over his desk for many years. The steeple was replaced a few years later, but I have seen photographs of the church taken when there was no steeple. So that's just a really nice piece of history, and it's nice of Geraldine to have allowed the church to have it. Very special. Now I have to find my place again. In 1926, there was a great centennial celebration marking the 100th anniversary of the building of the second meeting house. And all the pictures show a steeple. So by that time it was dead. Be sure to look at the photos, newspaper clippings, and programs from the centennial festivities. It really was a homecoming event, as many people traveled to attend. There were distinguished speakers, a banquet, musical presentations, etc. However grand the centennial celebration was, it is safe to say that the church was in the midst of a period of financial constraints. There were times when there was not a full-time minister. There were times when the church had to apply to the Missionary Society of Connecticut, the financial arm of the state organizing body, for aid. The demographics had changed. Rockville was the city. Vernon Center and its church was the backwater. Tellingly, I found this little written piece in I guess it was I don't know why it was put out, but it was, maybe it was announcing the officers. It was put out by the church, of course, in 1928. And as part of this little brochure, there was a creed for the country church. It was printed in this church pamphlet. It reads, "We will renew our faith in the church and the country. We will believe in its necessity. We will believe in its success. We will consecrate ourselves wholeheartedly to this service. We will overcome, with God's help, the mountains of difficulty, poor equipment, limited numbers, and limited means. We will serve the community in every way we can, by every means we can. A useful church does not die." So that kind of struck a chord with me, because obviously they had a proud history and a great thing going, but it was hard. It was a struggle. Although not a coastal town, Vernon sustained damage from the Great Hurricane of 1938. Much has been documented about the horrific storm and all the damage that was done by wind and water. Our church was affected in a significant way. According to a newspaper account, the steeple on the Vernon Center church was wrested from the sturdy oak foundation and tossed like a matchstick through the roof of the church. This was, of course, a devastating blow to the congregation. The roof had to be repaired, but there was no hope of replacing the steeple. We have a form on the display board that was circulated asking people to contribute over and above their regular pledge for repair to get the church in usable condition. The largest contribution was from the Ladies' Aid Society, $100. Other pledges ranged from $2 to $25. It was at this low point that an amazing thing happened. A wealthy businessman from Minneapolis happened to be traveling through New England. He purposely plotted his route through Vernon Center because he wished to see the village where his parents had lived in their youth and the church where they had married. The parents were Luther and Sarah Carpenter Ford, and they were indeed married in the church and active in its life until they moved to Minnesota in the latter part of the 19th century and made their fortune in the manufacture of Mrs. Stewart's bluing, a whitening agent that is still on the market today. In fact, according to the company website, it is available at Walmart. Mr. Allen Kellogg Ford, and John, there has to be a reason this guy was named Allen Kellogg Ford. We got to look into that, right? Mr. Allen Kellogg Ford, the traveling gentleman, and his brother Robert decided to have the steeple rebuilt as a memorial to their parents. They contracted with a New York City architect and engaged Knopfler Brothers of Manchester to build the new steeple. This happened, and a memorial and dedication service attended by the Ford brothers and their families took place on October 29, 1939. The generosity of the Fords is well documented in our archive, including correspondence between Allen Ford and Miss Edna Hammond, who was acting as secretary and treasurer of the church during this time. Mr. Ford's letters are on his company letterhead and always are a beautiful blue in color. It states at the bottom of the page, on his letterhead, only at the bottom, it's I think on that board. Believe it or not, this letter is signed with Mrs. Stewart's bluing. Try it yourself. So he was a good marketer too. The Vernon Congregational Church continued to struggle with finances and membership throughout the 1940s. I'm sure the war years were disruptive and not conducive to church growth. However, after the war, demographics changed again, and so did the church. In 1955, Mr. George S. Brooks writes in Cascades and Courage his definitive history of Vernon Rockville. This is what he says about what's happening with the church and the town. This was not to be the end of a mighty history in an area where the church had done its task. More recent history has proven otherwise, with the steady flow of population out of Hartford And with the great influx of employment in the East Hartford area, and with the completion of the excellent 4-lane highway through Vernon to Hartford, a high priority has been placed upon life in the suburbs. The result of this situation has been the absorption of new life into the town and the church. Great was the faith and courage of the few who carried on in seeming sight of the end. But the end had not come, and it has rather proved to be the beginning of a new era in the history of the old Mother Church, which was the cradle of our town of Vernon. By 1955, the church had received so many new members, most with young children and growing families, that the Sunday school facilities were woefully inadequate. The church needed to expand. A building fund campaign was put in place to raise the $50,000 needed to add an educational wing to the original building. An energetic young pastor, the Reverend George Higgins, was the perfect leader to spearhead this campaign. On February 12, 1957, the new Sunday school wing was dedicated. 300 people filled the sanctuary, and in the afternoon, almost as many attended the ribbon cutting ceremony. I guess you could say that the baby boom had manifested itself.